As Snyder fans sarcastically call them, real DC fans took to Twitter to rewrite DC history, to tell us that everybody loves the Flash movie on Max. Let me be absolutely clear, real DC fans. It doesn't matter how many times you rewatch The Flash on Max or post GIFs of the movie on Twitter. It doesn't rewrite history. It doesn't change anything. The movie's not suddenly okay. You can't cancel out that the director admitted that he had shit VFX in the Flash movie purposely. That it was a problematic movie. But most important of all, the Flash movie was a flop. You can never change that. Now let's talk about Blue Beetle. I think by the end of Monday, which is today, it probably would have grossed near on in $100 million globally in 2 freaking weeks. That is ridiculous. It's pathetic. But apparently, the most viewed movies on Cinema Day, when movies were reduced for around $4 in the States, were Blue Beetle and Barbie. Doesn't matter. Repeat after me. Blue Beetle was a flop. Now, real DC fans went deeper than that and told us to let them enjoy colourful movies. You can enjoy your colourful flops. No one is stopping you. Telling us that we're putting you off, other fans are putting you off from enjoying mid-rubbish movies. They actually called them. Real DC fans took to Twitter to complain that why can't they enjoy mid-bad DC movies? Well, if you're asking that question, you're insane. Nobody is stopping you from enjoying creative bankruptcy. You keep on telling us to support these movies or we're not real fans. It's not my duty to support CBMs. It's the duty of the people who own the IP and make the stuff to make good shit. The responsibility isn't on me or the other genuine fans, it's on them. And they are failing. So on today's show, I really want to ask what we should be doing here. Are darker CBMs, DC CBMs, the right way to go? Or should they be light, fluffy, and funny? Now, for me, there's no rules. There's absolutely no rules here. But let's look at it. Man of Steel, a serious, epic CBM. 650 million. Blue Beetle. Shazam 1 and 2. Sitcoms. Flops, flops, flops. Man of Steel made a considerable profit. Not the profit the studio wanted, but a considerable profit. Batman vs Superman, Dawn of Justice, which we're going to get into very shortly, because I want to ask if maybe that should have been a direct adaptation to The Dark Knight Returns. Anyway, Batman vs Superman, Dawn of Justice, a dark, serious movie. 850 million globally and a considerable profit. Again, we have to say it wasn't a profit that the studio wanted, but it made money. Again, the colourful, bad, mid-movies haven't made any money. The dark, epic movies have. They're the facts. So I don't think, as I say, I don't think there should be any rules whether a film should be light and funny or dark and serious. That's up to the person making the movie. And I'm not very strict on canon either. If you've got a good idea to adapt a CBM, then do it. To adapt a superhero, do it. Do it your way. That's what Snyder did, that's what David Ayer did, and I still want to see the Ayer cut. So, there's no rules what a movie should be. But, ultimately, I enjoy the Snyder movies more than Blue Beetle, more than Shazam. I'm less invested in those funny, family, bright movies. And I mean, when real DC fans were talking about this last night on Twitter, and putting all the pictures of films like Black Adam and Wonder Woman 84. Well, Black Adam doesn't have many gags, but when Black Adam does have gags, they actually hit. Wonder Woman 84 had very few gags. Yes, it was very colourful in its colour palette, but its actual tone, emotional tone, was actually very, very serious and very few gags. So that's interesting. Now, we'll never know what Wonder Woman 84 would have made outside of the pandemic, but it wasn't a very good film. So, the moral of the story is, real DC fans, that if you want to go and see colourful, funny sitcoms that have been made, nobody is stopping you. You cannot be blaming other people because you're bitter that these movies are failing. You can't handle it that these movies are failing. The facts are there. It hasn't worked because at the end of the day, you can make colourful sitcoms, but it isn't going to bring everyone out for DC. But Mick, what about the MCU? Well, let's look at the MCU, right? Because I think people are rewriting history with MCU movies as well. Iron Man had some gags, but it also was a very violent, action-packed, epic movie. So it wasn't a sitcom. It had a brighter colour palette, but it had some serious messaging, anti-war messaging as well. Iron Man 2 had some gags, had some serious messaging, explosive, dark at times as well. It really is a revenge story. The Incredible Hulk has very few gags, a very good, epic Hulk movie. Captain America, the first Avenger, a bright colour palette, the odd gags that are actually funny. Because MCU movies, when they tried to be funny in the old days, prior to Phase 4 and 5, were funny. So I could be here all day. Thor has some gags that work, but again, it's a very serious, emotional journey for Thor. I really like that movie. I love early MCU. So somehow along the way, it's been exaggerated that the MCU movies were sitcoms. But then we went to Spider-Man, the first two, like Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, and they did become a lot more lighter and comedic. And for me, those types of movies are not for me. Now, in terms of Superman the movie, very serious on Krypton, very serious on Smallville. Once they get to Metropolis, it's a lot more funnier and lighter. But there's still some dark moments in that film, even when Kal reaches Metropolis. So, at the end of the day, there's no rules for me what a movie should be. I think if you make a funny, light movie, you should still have serious themes, and all the best CBMs always mix it up. You can't have 100% light, funny, bright movie because there's nothing there to view. I hear people saying, well, I want happy stories. Well, I'm sorry. No one's going to sit there for 2.5 hours watching everyone being fakely happy. There has to be drama. There has to be a character journey. So I prefer what Man of Steel and BVS does and the Snyder Cut. It's real. I prefer what the Joker and the Batman and Batman Begins and the Dark Knight and the Dark Knight Rises does. I prefer that. The meat in the sandwich. Just because I like that, it doesn't mean you have to. But we have to look at what's more profitable. When we look at it. Now, we've spoken about the Snyder movies. The Batman made $750 million. The Joker movie made $1 billion. It did have a brighter colour palette than the Snyder movies, but it had some very serious, bright themes. Now, it was very important to me, that film, because I've had mental health issues all throughout my life, which I've learned to control, thankfully, and I was looking after my parents like Arthur Fleck was. So being someone who had to balance mental illness and looking after his parents with nobody helping him and having no emotional support at the time either, I understood how Arthur Fleck was feeling. Now, I didn't go out there and start killing people and doing things, but I suppose I must be an incel just because I got something out of that movie. If you want to call me an incel, you can call me an incel. It really doesn't matter to me. But the long and the short of it is that when you look at the Dark Knight trilogy, when you look at Joker, when you look at the Batman, when it comes to DC, people prefer more serious movies. Again, there's no rules. Now, it's clear that James Gunn may be looking to be giving us lighter movies from the latter phases of the MCU. But it's clear that there was very little investment in the first Shazam, even though it made a profit on, well over $300 million, but still not a lot of money, even though the movie was cheap to make. Shazam! Fury of the Gods went a deeper dive on the lighter, brighter, funnier movie. So did Blue Beetle. People didn't come out they wasn't invested. It seems to me, even though I will never say that a film should be pure dark, pure serious, or pure funny, I will never say that. I'm not Adolf Hitler. I am not a dictator. It's up to you what you prefer. But when you look at profitability, and relatability, the ones that are more serious make more money. Iron Man was a serious movie with gags in it. Captain America Civil War, Captain America the Winter Soldier had gags, but they were also very serious movies. But I think people are rewriting the history of the MCU. Early MCU was very, very good. Now, all the love and the plaudits that they were getting, because I'm a DC fan, right, was fucking annoying me. And DC was getting all the hate for being serious. I've heard The Critical Drinker, a YouTuber I like a lot, talking about how overly serious the Snyderverse was, and all that. Well, do you know what, mate? Some of us love that seriousness, and that's the point. But the darker, more serious movies are the movies that make more money. Now let's talk about Batman vs Superman. Batman vs Superman is really the moment that broke Twitter. It really was the film that really got WB to react so toxically and try and move away from Zack Snyder. Batman vs Superman made very bad people of us all. Whether you loved the movie or hated the movie, whether you were a blogger, a comic book artist, everyone acted in an ungentlemanly fashion. And we have to admit that. The movie triggered so many people. Because people were under the impression after Man of Steel that this was going to be an MCU type franchise, adapting comic book stories and giving you that kind of lighter, kind of environment from the MCU. There was a misunderstanding what the DCEU was. And I think maybe if Snyder and WB at the time were, just said, look, this is my vision, right? We're not trying to be the MCU. And I think that was part of the problem. Even the kind of trailers for BVS made it look like it was going to be a 2.5-hour slugfest between Batman and Superman. I mean, you have to ask the question if promoting a movie where Batman and Superman fight is the right thing. Now, Batman and Superman have always had a challenging relationship in the comics and animation. Batman hasn't always trusted Superman. But I think ultimately they've always been uncomfortable allies, and they've always been ultimately two men that respect each other and have a lot of love and respect for each other. And I think ultimately that's what Snyder was heading towards. And we saw that by the end of BVS and in Zack Snyder's Justice League Snyder Cut, and even in the embarrassment that is Justice League. But I've always asked the question, considering that Zack Snyder gave us so many panels in BVS taken directly from The Dark Knight Returns, would it have been a better idea to directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns for a Batman movie starring Ben Affleck? So there's a lot of kind of similarities to The Dark Knight Returns and BVS. BVS deals with a very older, bitter, tired Bruce Wayne and Batman, as does The Dark Knight Returns. And I think instead of calling it Batman vs Superman, something that Snyder and Terrio have already said they didn't want, I just think they should have done a solo Batman movie called The Dark Knight Returns. Now, if you don't know what The Dark Knight Returns is all about, basically, by the end of the graphic novel, Batman and Superman fight. Now, Superman really is the agent of the status quo. He takes orders from the government. And I think that would have been a very interesting place to go after Man of Steel for Superman as well. And it would have given him a brand new arc in the second movie of the DCEU. If you choose to make a direct Dark Knight Returns adaptation, coming off of Man of Steel. And I think that's a good idea. So I never understood why Zack didn't just directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns. He's already said, he's been quoted in public saying it's one of his favourite comics. So why not do it? You decided to have an older, bitter, tired old Batman. Exactly what he is in The Dark Knight Returns. As I say, he absolutely gave us some beautiful live action panels from the comics, taken directly from the comics, and Snyder was very faithful to those panels. So he clearly loves the comic book, as do I, and the animated two-part movie is outstanding. So I never really understood why Zack Snyder didn't directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns. Wouldn't they let him? Wasn't he allowed? I mean, if I ever had the honour and pleasure of interviewing him on this channel or anywhere, I'd love to ask him, Zack, why didn't you just directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns? Now, here's the thing for me, because as we've spoken before, we know that Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice upset a lot of people. In a lot of ways, it did break the DC fandom, which is a shame because it's such a well-made movie. And when I came out after my first viewing, I watched an early screening out here, and I felt I'd watched something primordial, something revolutionary. I felt like I'd watched something as good and as fantastic and as well made as The Dark Knight. And I felt that critics would feel the same. I couldn't believe it when critics shitted on this movie. Clearly because they cut half hour from the movie and the marketing made them think that this was a 2.5 hour slugfest between Batman and Superman. That's why people were underwhelmed by the movie and had certain negative opinions. But I think even with that half an hour, some of these people would have been triggered with Batman branding criminals and killing some criminals as well. Because a majority of the comics have always been that Batman, like Superman, has a no-kill policy. Now, I don't know the Dark Knight Returns graphic novel at the very least to tell you if Batman kills in that comic book. I don't know. But if you directly adapt the Dark Knight Returns graphic novel into live action, instead of what they did with Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, every time they say to you, Batman wouldn't do that, Zack could say he did it in the Dark Knight Returns comic. Could one of the reasons that Zack didn't want to adapt it and wanted to kind of a partial adaptation of that graphic novel, that he did want to do his own thing and he did want Batman to brand criminals and to kill criminals? But was it a step too far? For me, I don't mind Batman doing those things because I've always seen him since the Burton movies as a darker character capable of killing. I can understand why more diehard fans with more knowledge of the character than me were offended and upset by this. I never take away people's feelings. I don't put my feelings there instead of yours and say, you shouldn't feel that way. If you were upset by BVS, you have every right to be upset. But calling Zack Snyder Hack Snyder and saying he's not a good filmmaker and the film's not good is wrong. Just because it did things you didn't like doesn't make it a bad film. It's such a well-made film, and I still think it's one of the best CBMs ever made, technically, and the music and everything. It's a very good film. And also, what BVS does with Superman is a lot more controversial than Superman killing Zod at the end of Man of Steel. Because they had a problem after that. Again, Superman fans and real DC fans really upset, that Superman shouldn't kill. And certainly I would say it's more important that Superman doesn't kill than Batman doesn't kill. I think that's very, very important. So instead of trying to win some friends, Snyder decided to continue to shave against the grain, which I had no issue with. So Superman was a lot more moodier in this film. He rarely smiled. I mean, he actually does smile in Man of Steel. What the idiots say about Man of Steel and him not smiling is bullshit. So he's a much more moodier character because of the environment he finds himself in. It's a very deep story, BVS, about Superman being rejected. People are blaming him. Half the people are blaming him because basically Zod only came to Earth because of Superman. The destruction only happened. Zod only caused that destruction because of Superman. So Superman is somewhat responsible. So that's why I think Man of Steel is a very clever story, because inadvertently, what happens in MOS is Clark's fault. But he didn't do it purposely. And he does try and clean up a mess that he didn't create, his father created, and Zod created, and his people created. And I think that's important to say that. But people were upset. But I think, right, if you just directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns, you get rid of these messy situations. Because here's the thing, DC has never done a direct adaptation, nor has the MCU or Marvel really. They haven't really ever faithfully directed a live action CBM directly from the comics. You know, they've taken them, but they've done their own thing, because filmmakers always say you can't copy and paste a comic. No, you can't copy and paste a little magazine with, dialogue balloons and great pictures, but what you can do, you can be faithful to the story in the comic. So it's clear that Dark Knight Returns would, if you adapted it into a movie, would be a very short movie if you literally copy and pasted the comics. But what Snyder could have done, and I think it would have done him and the DCEU more favors, if he just took that exact story from the Dark Knight Returns comics and made it a movie. Because as I say, Batman and Superman still fight at the end of that story. So everything's there. Everything's there that you could have used in BVS. And the only thing you probably would have had to have taken out is killing and the branding. Batman vs. Superman has one of the best moments in any Batman movie. It's that Batmobile chase scene when he's going after the kryptonite and those villains and Anatoly. It's visually beautiful, stunning. I've never seen better Batman action. And then, Matt Reeves tries to do something with his Batmobile chase scene. Now, I like it, but ultimately, the more I see it, the less effective it becomes to me. And it's nowhere near the epicness and the action and, the robustness of Snyder's Batmobile chase scene. It's, as I say, it's one of the best things I've ever seen in a comic book movie. Snyder can do these things. There's so much good. There's more good than bad in Batman vs. Superman. Then there's the whole Martha moment. I will never believe, I can't believe and still can't understand, and I'm scratching my head, how people took advantage of that scene and tried to make a mockery of the film because of it. I ain't going to sit here again and again and justify that scene. You did it on purpose. You took that scene and you twisted it. Mostly MCU fans and Snyder haters did. But, you don't even have to be intelligent to understand it. He's about to kill the man. He thinks he's a monster. He's an alien. He doesn't see the humanity inside of him. He then says, okay, I'm going to explain it to you one last time. You're going to let them kill Martha. Bruce's mother was called Martha. She's dead. So imagine if that's you, right? Why is he saying, save Martha? Why is he saying that? Is my mum still alive? Is there a chance to save my mum? What's going on here? Why is he saying the name Martha? That's what I'd be thinking anyway. I don't know if that's what the filmmakers meant to do. Why did you say that name? Exactly, right? Why did you say that name? He's confused. So Lois comes in and saves the day and says, it's his mother's name. What happens then is his mother has got the same name. Yes, but that's not the reason they stopped fighting. The liars and the idiots tried to say they stopped fighting because their mothers had the same name. That's not the point. All of a sudden, he doesn't see an alien, a monster. He sees a human being. And that's the whole point of that scene. But there was a conspiracy of people, and maybe these were people with fake accounts. Maybe they were from Marvel Studios. Maybe this was done on purpose by fake. We will never know. But I will never understand why they took that scene out of context. But that's where the problems were. Because once you make a movie that some people are offended by, they're going to find other things to use against you, whether they're right or wrong about those things. And adapting The Dark Knight Returns takes that away from the situation. Because The Dark Knight Returns is a really good story. He's retired and he's forced to come back. It really is a good story. They've got the female Robin. That would have been great. And I think Zack would have done a great job with that because he has spoken about adapting The Dark Knight Returns. The problem is, mate, you've kind of already done it, but not done it. And, when I hear him say that, and I love Zack, but just because you love someone, it doesn't mean you can't constructively criticise him. Like I've done when I said it wasn't a good idea in Zack Snyder's Justice League or in Justice League generally to do a Superman rebirth story because you take Superman out of most of the central elements of that story. But it doesn't mean I don't love the Snyder Cut. It doesn't mean I don't love Zack. I can constructively criticise someone I love, adore, and will never ignore, right? But I think, seeing he said he wanted to adapt the graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns, why didn't he just do it instead of doing BVS? And I think, ultimately, I love BVS. I wouldn't want to be without BVS. But I think for the studio, for the IP's sake, Batman, Superman's and DC's sake, and for the building of the universe, if they didn't go the BVS way and went and adapted The Dark Knight Returns, who knows where we would have been right now. So I think the common sense decision would have been to adapt The Dark Knight Returns. And as I said earlier, I don't really understand why they didn't do that. Great story, popular story. It's like Flashpoint. It's the same thing as Flashpoint. I mean, Zack was looking to adapt that story via a director he was bringing in, like he brought in David Ayer to do Suicide Squad, a really, really good director. And maybe they would have been more accurate with that story and just implemented the Snyderverse within it. I don't understand how you try and adapt a Flashpoint movie as Machete did, and Hodgson did. Of course, she's a political extremist, she's a feminist, totally the wrong person. She wrote Birds of Prey. It was a fucking disaster. Look, it's ridiculous. But I don't see how you decide to adapt a Flashpoint story and you don't copy and paste at least the story. You can't do a better story than Jeff Johns' graphic novel of Flashpoint. The fucking thing is amazing. It has everything. Back to the Future 2 did a better job of adapting the Flashpoint story from the graphic novels than Andy Machete's movie did. Do you think the Flash movie would have struggled if they faithfully adapted Flashpoint? Of course not. It would have been epic. But oh no, we can't have Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman being evil. Better instead to have her there so she can mock Batman and the Flash with the lasso of truth. Much better, isn't it? And that's what I'm saying about The Dark Knight Returns. I mean, at least BVS was a great epic movie with a great message. And it was a great message, and it was a great movie, and I love it. But as I say, for the sake of the IP, adapting The Dark Knight Returns, considering that's what Zack was kind of doing with BVS, with directly adapting beautiful comic book panels and doing them beautifully. Brilliant. You've got a skeleton of the story you want in The Dark Knight Returns. So for me, it was a big mistake not to directly adapt The Dark Knight Returns. For me, it was anyway, because of everything that happened with BVS. Even though it's a great movie and I love it, look what happened. BVS, rightly or wrongly, destabilised everything. Now, if they stuck with Snyder after BVS, I think they would have got through the controversy. They would have done. But they reacted. They reacted because they got nervous. They'd invested so much in this. They wanted to catch up with Disney. They wanted to beat Disney. They wanted to do the business that Marvel Studios were doing. And the reaction to Batman versus Superman scared the living shit out of them. And then it got even worse with Suicide Squad because some people didn't like that film either. The whole damage tattoo thing, which I thought, again, the outrage for that was absolutely pathetic and ridiculous. But I think if you avoid what they did with BVS and you just adapt The Dark Knight Returns, I think the DCEU would have gone past what Marvel was doing. It still would have been serious, it still would have been dark, but you would have adapted a comic book story a graphic novel that people love and people respect. So every time people say to you, but you made Batman do this, it's in the comics, people love it. They can't come at you. And that is my point.